Hey guys, this is going to be the mini lesson on England, and I hope you're able to follow along. Hopefully, you will be able to. We'll see in a second. All right. England, chaos to a new monarchy. Right? We've just finished how France emerged out of the Hundred Years' War as a new monarchy that evolved into absolutism. You've learned that absolutism corrupts absolutely because now the Valois dynasty was more about itself than its people. We saw the Estates General kind of dissipate because of that. Well, England is going to have a different history. They're going to go from chaos into a new monarchy. And I do believe England is the most stable of the states. All right. What has happened? We know that England has just lost the War of the Roses. Coming out of 1453, England is going to lose a ton of land. There are many English nobles who owned that land, and their power was tied to that land. So once they lost it, they blamed the king. So coming out of this war, and typically this is true, when countries come out of defeats, there is civil wars that happen. Well, this civil war is going to be called the War of the Roses. They're very frustrated at the Hundred Years' War, and now they're hoping to regain their lost liberty, they being the nobles. The two families that are going to compete for this are the Lancasters and Yorks. Sometimes we call it the War of the Roses because they wore roses on their armor. The Lancasters were the red rose, and the Yorks were the white rose. The last of the York rulers is Richard. If you wanted to know more about Richard, he is an evil guy who basically had his two nephews, or three nephews, forget the number. They put him in the Tower of London to starve to death because they were the rightful heirs. He excludes them, dies. Not really need to know that, but if you want more information, rock on. But the War of the Roses is going to be fought as an outcome of the Hundred Years' War, and the Lancasters and Yorks are going to attempt to gain power. And that's Richard III is an evil man. And at the end of the Battle of Bosworth, the War of the Roses comes to an end with Richard dying. If you Google Richard III's body, you will find that just a couple years ago, they found his body buried underneath of a random parking lot. If you wanted to know more about that and kind of read through that, it's totally cool, but not relevant for our class. But what we see is the Battle of Bosworth is when the War of the Roses comes to an end. Richard III is dead, and the Lancasters are victorious. And the result is modern England begins its evolution. I do identify the end of the War of the Roses as the birth of modern England. You may want to handwrite that. I do think it's kind of important. But that's what we see. And who is the winner of this? It's not just the Lancasters, it's Henry Tudor. And Henry Tudor becomes Henry VII. He becomes the first modern king of England. You might say, why is he the seventh? Because he's the seventh Henry of England. If you want to know more about that, you can add the research all you want, but that's not relevant. All right. So Henry Tudor, when he becomes his king, he wants to unite England. So that's going to be his number one goal, to unite England. I'm going to let you write that down. What's his number one goal? Unite England. There's going to be two ways he does it. Number one, he's going to marry into the York family. So the Lancasters and York are now married into a singular family. Well, if you got them both, that creates the Tudor dynasty. So what he does, he wants a definitive end. Even though he's related to the Lancasters, he can identify the Lancasters. He wants to identify that they are a new dynasty. So with that, he wants a new symbol. I have right here to the left in the images, you have the white rose and the red rose, right? Those are the two roses that were fighting it out in the War of the Roses. Well, Henry VII wanted an icon, an image that represents a new England. And what do we have? He has a botanist actually create a new rose. This is called the Tudor rose. I'll let you look at it. It's pretty, isn't it? What you see is the York white rose is in the middle, right? The Lancaster red rose, they're victorious. So there is a little bit of a tit for tat here, but again, we'll see that. But this becomes the new symbol. The Tudor rose represents the new unification of England. So by the time, these are the first things Henry does. Henry says, I want stability. So what do? I marry into the enemy family. We create one dynasty, the new dynasty. And then to represent the dynasty, they have a new icon or image, and that becomes the Tudor rose. It's kind of cool that there's a botanist that did this. If you want to know more about that, have at it. The second thing he does, he immediately wants to reduce the power of the nobility. Because the nobility, remember, they're real quick. I want you to think about kings want to unite, nobility want to divide. Nobility have power if they are individual power, okay? So the nobles, they're kind of salty. They don't want to lose power. So what does Mr. Henry do? Well, the first thing he does is get rid of livery and maintenance. I want you to know that word, livery and maintenance. You might say, is it livery? Could be. I call it livery. Everybody ready? Livery and maintenance was the nobles' ability to have a private army. As long as they have livery and maintenance, they have their private army, which means they can always have another civil war. By Henry taking the livery and maintenance away from the nobles, no longer do they have the ability to fight. So therefore, by ending livery and maintenance, Henry unites England by reducing the power of the nobility. I hope you get that. It's a military power. Then he used a series of spies. He wanted to know who was the bad nobles. So he used a series of spies. What happens? What happens if a spy finds an unruly noble? Well, they report to the king, and then Henry VII invites that noble to what we call the court of the Star Chamber. The court of Star Chamber is not a place you want to be visited. You do not want to visit. It's a place of torture. The rebellious noble would be brought into the Star Chamber, asked if he were guilty. He's going to say he's not guilty, and then they would torture him. One of the most interesting tortures were the rollers. And what would happen? Hands would be tied to one roll. The feet would be tied to the other roll, and then there was two mechanisms, and they would then pull the bodies apart, and your back would be like a accordion. And eventually you would go through the most painful death. The whole point was to bully these nobles into admitting that they were wrong. And then once they admitted they were guilty, then they would be taken to public execution. I'd much rather be publicly executed. It's one swipe of an axe rather than being tortured to death. But that's up to you. But in the end, by getting rid of livery and maintenance, reducing the military power of the nobles, utilizing spies and the court of Star Chambers, by the time Henry VII dies, he has successfully reduced the power of the nobles and centralized England. Well, is that enough? Not at all. He also focuses on becoming the Burger King. Remember, that word burger is not something you eat. That is the merchants. Henry creates a new relationships with the merchants, the burghers. He creates policies to allow them to expand infrastructure. Infrastructure are the roads, the bridges, etc. that connects the country. They want to do more business in between these. And he creates tax incentives to do so. So his policies positively impact the merchants, and this will transform England into a modern Europe. The merchants, Burger King, king and merchants. He reduced the power of the nobles and then elevated the burghers. And the last thing here is something I see a little differently than Dr. Spielvogel. Though Parliament and Henry didn't like each other that much, Henry VII created a tradition of Parliament. If you don't know what Parliament is, bless our hearts, Parliament is the representative government of England even today. We'll talk more about that evolution later. But what I want to point out is during this use of Parliament, right? Parliament is evolving. And what happens is anytime Henry VII has a difficult decision to make, he would go to Parliament. Now, I will tell you, Parliament will always say yes to the king. But because the king is sharing power with Parliament, I'm going to say that again, the king is sharing power with Parliament. When things go bad, the king also shares the blame. Very different than France. In France, you have a king, The Estates General lost its power. The king, so when bad things happen, everyone blames the king. In England, because Henry used the tradition of Parliament, when bad things occurred, Parliament would share the blame with England, with a king. So, with that, I will tell you Henry VII is the first modern king in English history because he works to create a new monarchy, the English nation state. He does that by unifying England through marriage and the new rose as a symbol of the Tudor dynasty. He also reduces the power of the nobility through ending livery maintenance and spies and the court of star chamber. He creates a modern England because he has a new reliance on the merchants, making him the Burger King. And Parliament, he established a tradition of Parliament. I hope that makes sense. So in the end, Henry VII established political stability that allowed for modern England to evolve. His marriage brought a sense of unity to the fractured England. Rather than focusing on absolute power, he utilized Parliament to share in difficult decisions, as he greatly reduced the power of the nobles. Additionally, his economic policies allowed the expansion, earning him the nickname Burger King. Hence, England was politically and economically stable because of the new monarchy. Again, I hope that makes sense. If you have questions, pop off to the Google Meet. But with that said, have a great day.